Huh? Huh? I popped a couple mollies, then I hopped in that Ferrari with a couple ratchet bitches. All they wanna do is party. Got like 4 grams in my blood, promethazine in my cup.
Welcome back to another Swift tutorial. By now we're up to Xcode Beta 4 and starting to get into a few fairly advanced kind of topics. Today we're actually going to tackle something that might be common to you if you've done Xcode projects in Objective-C. We're going to talk about delegates, and we're going to talk about using delegates kind of as a means to pass data back and forth between different objects. And so our classic example that we're going to use today is up-and-coming rap artist known as Lil Debbie. So we're going to jump right into that. If you want to get started, you can get started with your own playground. In this case, we have our own already on our system, so we're going to just open this up. And so basically, if you remember from our discussion of protocols, a protocol is something that you can it's basically a list of rules that you can set out that your classes have to follow. So in one case, that can be saying, okay, every class that adopts this protocol needs to have this particular variable on it. Or this class needs to have this particular, all classes that adopt this protocol need to have this function on it. In this case, we're actually going to use both. So we're going to define something called a Lil Debbie delegate protocol, which is basically a set of rules that somebody who is a delegate of the rapper Lil Debbie must follow. And so this is kind of what we're going to get stepped through. Instead of passing data, though, just to get us started off, we're actually going to refer to a more common practice out there in the community known as passing blunts between one another. So to do that, we're actually going to define something that is a blunt. It's just a really basic struct that has a kind of type on it. So we're just going to say struct blunt. It's got a variable called a type, which is of type optional string, which basically this question mark right here by the string means that we may or may not have a type of blunt defined. So you can have a blunt that has no type, or you can have a specific type of blunt that's Cali weed or something. I don't know. I don't really smoke blunts, but you kind of get the idea. So that's cool. That's the thing that we're going to be passing between different instances of classes. The blunt is sort of like our data. Okay, so we've got a thing that's going to get passed. The next thing we got to do is define a protocol for the thing that passes the blunt. In this case, we're going to call that protocol a Lil Debbie delegate protocol. Okay, so any individual who is a delegate of Lil Debbie, i.e. one of Lil Debbie's bitches, is going to adhere to the Lil Debbie delegate protocol. And that means there are basically two things that a delegate of Lil Debbie's must do or have. One thing is that a Lil Debbie delegate must have a blunt for Debbie. So must have some kind of a blunt. It's of type blunt. And it is basically just holding on to this blunt that this delegate is going to pass to Debbie at some point. Okay, and this Lil Debbie delegate must also have a function called pass blunt, or must be capable of passing the blunt to Debbie. Makes sense. You've got a blunt, and you also have to pass the blunt. Oh yeah, that's right. So we have to have this property declaration get set. Basically, what this is saying is this is a property that can be gotten and set. So let's say something that adheres to the Lil Debbie delegate protocol, we'd be able to set the blunt for it and also get the blunt. In a way, that's kind of like passing a blunt to Lil Debbie's delegate. In any case, so we've got a protocol that if you're a bitch of Little Debbie, you must follow these rules. Okay, great. So now we have to define a class that actually adheres to the Little Debbie delegate protocol. We're just going to call that class bitch with the protocol declaration right after it. If you remember my tutorial on the Douglas protocol, whenever something adheres to a protocol, it has to have the declaration of the protocol right after the class name. Okay, and so naturally I'm guessing that this compiler error that we're getting right now is one of, such and such class does not adhere to the protocol, which means that we need to put the variable, the blunt for Debbie, onto our class. So blunt for Debbie, type blunt equals, and we'll just use our we'll have it already initialized, and see how it asks for a type of blunt, optional string. So if we want to enter that in, sure, why not? Let's say it's a Cali weed blunt, because that's the kind of blunt that a Lil Debbie delegate presumably would have. And then we also have to actually implement our function pass blunt. So if we start typing pass blunt in, Xcode automatically recognizes that and kind of goes with it. And so real simple, pass blunt. Well, we don't really have to do anything to the blunt once we've got it. So basically, like I said, a Little Debbie delegate is just kind of hanging out in the background. Little Debbie says, all I need is 2 cups of some lean and a bad bitch just to roll on my weed. Presumably her bad bitch has already rolled the weed, and we just need to, return the blunt, the blunt for Debbie. So that's our implementation of a bitch class, which follows the Little Debbie delegate protocol, has a blunt that it's kind of holding on to, and then is capable of actually passing the blunt off to Little Debbie. So that's pretty cool, just to kind of give you an overview. Now, right now we've got nothing in our execution window, obviously, because we really haven't run any code. We've just kind of defined some of the stuff that we're doing. So, I think it's important at this point that we actually define who is Lil Debbie. Okay, so we've got a class called Lil Debbie. All right, and then Lil Debbie obviously must have some kind of a blunt. Well, see, here's kind of where we get into this this optional, non-optional sort of thing in Swift. Okay, so what did I just do here? All right, so it's this kind of the same thing that we did with the definition of the type for the blunt. Basically, Little Debbie may or may not have a blunt with this question mark here, with this optional sort of declaration. Most of the time, yeah, she's got a blunt, but not always. And that's kind of why she needs her delegates, right? Like, her delegates are the ones that are going to, at some point, pass the blunt to her so that she does actually have a blunt. But basically what we've said in this class definition is, you know what, it's uncertain whether or not Lil Debbie, at the moment, has a blunt. But it is always certain that Lil Debbie has a delegate, okay? Because Lil Debbie, as you are aware, has bitches who themselves have bitches who are more ratchet than your bitches, and your bitches want her bitches, so you're leaving with no bitches. That's just kind of a long and complicated way of saying that a delegate is absolutely necessary. And so if you look at this compiler error right here, basically what it's saying is you need to have an initializer for Little Debbie. And in that case, what we need to do is define the delegate that in this initialization function. So basically, when we create Little Debbie, we need to create her with a delegate first. Okay, so there's some such a bitch that follows the Lil Debbie delegate protocol first that gets passed off to Lil Debbie when we create the class of Lil Debbie. So we'll say self.delegate, or Lil Debbie's delegate, okay, equals delegate, which is the same delegate that was up here in the initialization function. So Lil Debbie must always have a delegate whenever whenever we create an instance of Lil Debbie. All right. So the last thing, right now it seems like, okay, there's a way for Lil Debbie may or may not have a blunt. Okay. She has a delegate that can pass her a blunt, but where are we saying that Lil Debbie can get the blunt from her delegate? Well, we actually have to define another function called get a blunt. Okay, which is really basic. All it is Debbie's blunt equals delegate dot pass blunt, which is to say, in many ways, that the only way that Lil Debbie more or less relies on her bitches. That if Lil Debbie didn't have a bad bitch just to roll all of her weed, then she would never actually have any weed at all. Because the only way that she can get that optional blunt to have some kind of a blunt behind it is for that delegate of hers to pass the blunt. Okay, so let's just say, once Lil Debbie does get a blunt, Lil Debbie got a blunt from her delegate of type just so you know what the type is. Debbie's blunt dot type. Okay, so then we actually would be able to see where Lil Debbie got her blunt. All right, so at this point, all we've got is the definition of everything that we're doing here. Okay, so we know that Lil Debbie must always have a delegate. Okay, we know that the only way that Lil Debbie can ever get a blunt is for the delegate to pass the blunt to her. We've got a protocol for something that is one of Lil Debbie's bitches, and that means that thing must always have a blunt, and it must always be capable of passing off that blunt. Okay, real basic kind of an idea here, but this just is really ultimately an analogy for how you get data from different objects, or one way to get data from different objects. And the point is that, a bitch is just anything that adopts the Lil Debbie delegate protocol. Lil Debbie may or may not have all kinds of bitches. She even says she has bitches who have bitches. Okay, so it may not be this bitch or that particular bitch, but any bitch, anything that follows the Lil Debbie delegate protocol must be capable of passing off the blunt.